Good evening, Daniel Nation. Welcome to our monthly podcast, the Daniel Report, and it's good to have everybody back on our show tonight. This evening, I have a very special guest, Luke Macias from the Luke Macias Show. Welcome, Luke. How are you tonight?
Good, Brandon. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Luke is a prominent political consultant and conservative activist in Texas, and of course, the host of the Luke Macias Show. So, Luke, I wanted to do a show on the 2026 primary results, and let's just start off tonight with a bird's eye view of the election. So, I read that Democrats cast about 100,000 more votes than Republicans. So, was Republican turnout really weak in this election?
Republican turnout was not weak. Republican turnout was higher than it normally is in a gubernatorial year. We had the highest ever Republican primary turnout of a gubernatorial year. And so that is very good for Republicans. It shows that we have a lot of interest. The reality is, though, on the other side, Democrats have a massive amount of energy. They're very excited. They're very energized. They do believe that we are one election away from just total Republican dominance. You and I might disagree with that, but that's what they believe. And so they are voting like it. And we've seen that in the energy that came out both in the special election in Senate District 9 and then in the turnout numbers. Now, there are some other factors, like the fact that they actually had a contested statewide ballot at the top with the attorney general's race, the U.S. Senate race. Normally, Democrats line up four or five people, anoint one person for each position, and run them. And then they have very low turnout because there's not something pulling people out to the polls. In this scenario, Democrats knew we have to decide whether we want James Tallarico or Jasmine Crockett. So a lot more Democrats that normally were Democrat general election voters came out and voted in their primary. That's a factor that doesn't really determine whether November is going to go well or poorly for us. But the reality is that Democrats have more energy than Republicans. Every single Democrat is planning on coming to vote in November. And every Republican and conservative is not planning on voting in November at this moment in time. They don't feel scared. They're not worried. Some of them think we're winning. Some of them are just tired. So we have to get our fellow patriotic Texans engaged in the November election if we're going to maintain the majority we currently have.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. So let's talk about some of the key races in this primary. Of course, I think the big upset of the night was Steve Toth defeating Congressman Dan Crenshaw. So what was going on down in the Woodlands in that race?
It was very interesting. I saw a poll 10 days before that election that showed that Steve Toth was beating Dan Crenshaw by 4 or 5 points, which is within the margin of error of that poll. The thing that stood out to me, though, was that 30% of the poll participants had already voted. And of those people, Steve Toth was winning 61 to 31. And that just blew my mind that you saw that everybody who was showing up was actually picking Steve when they got into the ballot. Um, Montgomery County is one of the most conservative counties in Texas. Truthfully, it's Patriotville down there. And that is something that Dan Crenshaw, I think, underestimated just how organized the grassroots are. There's the Montgomery County Tea Party that's still very active. There's the Texas Patriots PAC. There's small individual groups throughout the county that are very active. If you are a grassroots candidate that runs Montgomery County, you know you're going to have a couple dozen people block walking for you, hosting meet and greets, doing things. So Steve Toth is somebody who's really helped build that. He ran against a Rhino incumbent back in 2012 to get elected. He was the first kind of, I say he was the conservative foothold in Montgomery County that then grew from there. So I really see him as this pivotal figure that was able to then amass all that conservative grassroots energy and turn it into criticism of Dan Crenshaw. And Dan has very openly been comfortable criticizing conservatives and Republicans in his own party for a long time. And I think he underestimated Steve Toth. And it wasn't the fact that he just lost, it's the fact that he lost so handily. It was such a wide margin. And so that sends a really strong message to Republicans that we actually anticipate and expect for you to deliver results, or we might replace you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Toth did a really good job campaigning on Crenshaw's record on the border and the amount of people he was letting, it was in favor of letting across the border as well. He did a really good job in messaging on that too. So that opened a lot of voters' eyes. Let's talk about the U.S. Senate race. Ken Paxton made it into the runoff against John Cornyn, where they were basically neck and neck. I mean, did you expect Paxton to do a little bit better in the results than he did, or did you think it was going to be a pretty close race?
Yeah, I do think John Cornyn overperformed people's expectations. Ken came in along where people probably thought he was going to land. Definitely a little under. My anticipation was that Ken Paxton was probably going to be in the 44 to 45 percentile, and he was at 41. So he was several points under. But it was really the fact that so many of the undecideds ended up going with John. Some people would credit that to just the amount of spending at the end. Those undecided voters at the end of the US Senate race were people that were least connected to politics in general. And so those people tend to move with where the money is going. Wesley Hunt probably fell further than people anticipated him falling at the end, with both Ken Paxton's super PAC, John Cornyn's super PAC, and John Cornyn's campaign going after Wesley. The question was whether those voters were going to end up coming to Ken or John. And they ended up probably, just rough math, 2/3 went to John, 1/3 went to Ken. And so it put Senator Cornyn and Ken Paxton within 1 percentage point of each other. But it definitely was an overperformance of John Cornyn compared to where people thought he would end up.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I saw where Paxton went out 2 days after the election and he posted on X that he would consider dropping out of the race if Senate leadership agreed to lift the filibuster and pass the Save America Act. Was that just a ploy to call out John Cornyn for not lifting the filibuster, or is Paxton really serious about dropping out of the race if the Senate lifts it?
I mean, I think he said it multiple times that he'd be open to dropping out. President Trump, of course, put his statement out saying, "Hey, I don't want a contentious runoff election." My personal opinion, if I had to guess, is that Trump was going to lean towards supporting whoever ended up being on top. So if Paxton had a 6 or 7 point lead over Cornyn, he might have been kind of leaning Ken's way. With Cornyn being a point over Paxton, he was probably leaning Cornyn's way as far as an endorsement goes. Um, but he made his position clear. My goal would be that we don't have a contentious runoff and just can focus on the general. And I think Ken went out and said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm going to give you some leverage because the Save America Act is actually about doing just that, saving the United States of America, because we have a bunch of blue states that let you vote whether or not you are who you are." Okay, that is kind of a major, I don't know, pillar of participating in a democratically elected republic, is the fact that everyone who votes is who they say they are. And the fact that we don't have that in blue states is a real problem for our elections. And so Ken Paxton says, "I'll give you this SAVE Act, Mr. President. And if the Senate can deliver that kind of policy to you, then I'd be willing to consider stepping down." And if John Thune and John Cornyn were able to convince the rest of their Republican colleagues to do so, which they have a lot of influence, then maybe President Trump gets what he wants: a less contentious runoff election and something that's going to save our country for not only this election, but many elections moving forward. And what we've seen is that many of the Republicans in the US Senate have just kind of dug in. It's the same senators who say, "Hey, we don't want contentious primaries, but we also don't want to deliver a marquee win to the president." People are very frustrated with the fact that we've passed less policy under this presidential administration than any term that I've seen in the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years. I'm sure you could go back and find some really slow time. But if you look at recent history, we are doing less from a policy perspective than ever. And Republicans in the Senate seem to be the ones to blame.
Yeah, I think Democrats also need to look at the polling on the Save America Act. It has wide bipartisan support. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. And if they were smart, they'd be paying attention. Now, let's talk about the Democrats for just a second. The Democratic primary for U.S. Senate, we got James Tallarico, who is arguably one of the most liberal lawmakers in Texas, defeating Jasmine Crockett. And you got Tallarico, who's going out there saying God is non-binary and God is the masculine and feminine and everything in between. We got him out on Joe Rogan's show saying that Mother Mary had to consent to becoming the mother of Jesus. Therefore, Christians should support abortion rights. So, I mean, it would be absolutely scary to imagine this guy becoming our U.S. senator. So my question is, who do you think has the best shot at defeating him in November, Cornyn or Paxton?
Both of them have flaws, and that is the difficult thing to assess. Ken Paxton, one of the problems that Republicans have in off year elections is that we have had trouble turning out Trump voters. There's a group of people that vote when Trump is on the ballot that don't come back out 2 years later. And we've seen that negatively affect us both the year after Trump got elected president. And then, of course, it looks like it could be heavily affecting us going into this midterm. If you ask the question which of the two is going to do a better job turning out the Trump voters that want to see more Trump policies, then I think Ken Paxton will do a better job. If you ask who will have a softer approach and a more palatable record to suburban women in Collin County or Williamson County, then the answer is John Cornyn. And so the question is, which of those two is going to more positively affect the Republican ticket? The truth is, I don't know that there is an answer. I don't know that either of them give us a big advantage. I think Ken will fire up the base and give people more motivation to go out and get their friends out to vote. And I think John Cornyn would overperform in something like a Williamson County or a Collin County. The reality is that every Republican needs to take November really seriously, regardless of who's at the top of our ticket. And if we do that, I think we can have a 2020 election year instead of a 2018 election year where we were caught kind of flat-footed. The Beto momentum took everyone by surprise, and we ended up losing quite a bit. If we can all take this really seriously, then I think we will do okay. I think people might be overanalyzing it because I'll say this: the last 3 or 4 polls that have been done don't show a difference between Ken Paxton or John Cornyn as our U.S. Senate nominee.
Wow. So, I mean, it's all about turnout, get out the vote. So, we've got to get Republicans to the polls in November. Let's talk about some statewide races. Let's start off with the gubernatorial race. You had Doc Pete Chambers coming in at 11% of the vote. I know a lot of people like Doc. As a matter of fact, I had Doc on my show back in January. Did Doc ever have a legitimate shot at beating Greg Abbott?
No, there's a lot of people that decide to run for office, and I've had conversations with a lot of these people. They'll call me and say, "Hey, I want to run for Congress." You say, "Okay, what is your plan to run for Congress?" And when you hear their plan, you go, "Hey, you sound like a conservative. You should consider running for county commissioner, or you should consider running for school board." There's other people who have a plan that sounds like they should run for Congress. The way I talk about it is, it's like going to war. And that's really what a campaign is at some level. You're going to war. You're trying to, let's say, if you're taking out an incumbent, you're trying to amass troops. So you go, okay, you want to go take out that group. How many troops do you have? Well, me and my friend. Okay, well, that's 2 muskets. They got a cannon and they have walls and they have catapults. I mean, what's going on? I don't know. So I'm crossing time frames here because this guy's a musket, this guy's a catapult, but bear with me. And so at the end of the day, you go, okay, well, I don't know that there's a plan to accomplish what you're telling me your mission is to accomplish. And so that's, I think, something what we see on the flip side. Let's look at some of the conservative insurgents that were victorious. You have Kristen Plaisance defeating Cecil Bell in Montgomery County, Dennis Giesemann defeating Stan Kitzman. These are incumbents who had the support of Sands Casinos, Texans for Lawsuit Reform, and others that spent well over $1 million to try to re-elect these more moderate to liberal Republicans, and they were unseated. Why? Because their opposition had a real plan. And so when Kristen Plaisance put $110,000 of her own money into her race, that was enough to give her a legitimate path, which then motivated other people to jump on board and support her efforts. The same with Dennis. If Kristen Plaisance had taken that same energy and decided to run for Congress or had decided to run for a statewide office, then it would have gone a lot. It would have been spread out. It wouldn't have gone as far. And that support she could amass and those grassroots people that were in her corner and the money that she had would have quickly dissipated. And her name ID still would be at 5, 6, or 7%. So I think that's my general observation on kind of races as a whole, because I saw really good people running in different positions that just didn't seem to have a plan for what they would do. I will say this about Governor Greg Abbott. He is and has delivered a significant amount of conservative policy. And I think that his critics had a difficult time painting him the way they wanted to paint him. He actually did work hand in hand with grassroots 2 years ago to deliver conservative victories and take out a number of the strongest rhinos in the Texas legislature that have been the largest roadblocks to conservative policy. And when a governor is willing to do that, and then it widens the gap, it widens the path for conservative policies, and then we pass more Republican priorities than we ever have. It doesn't mean we got everything we wanted. It doesn't mean there's not policy still left on the table. And you and I have been publicly very critical of Republicans who have not passed certain policies that we believe align with our principles. But it does mean that what Governor Abbott has done over the last couple of years has greatly increased our ability to pass conservative policy. And I think that's one reason why a lot of people supported his reelection.
Yeah, yeah, appreciate your take on that. That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about another statewide race. Nate Sheets defeated three-term Ag Commissioner Sid Miller 53% to 47. Were you surprised by that?
I definitely thought it was not super likely. I would have given Nate on election night maybe a 40% chance of winning, which is higher than I would have given him 3 weeks prior to that. So, in early February, I'd have given him a 20% chance of winning. And when we were about a week out, I saw a lot of the momentum surging toward him and a lot of the undecideds. Nate did something very unique, and I will give him credit for this. He went around and he met with grassroots people all across the state of Texas. And very few statewide candidates are willing to put in this much time and effort to do this because it takes a ton of work. But he went and sat in people's living rooms and he met on Zoom calls with 5 or 6 grassroots people and gave his pitch for what he thought could be improved at the Agriculture Commission, Department of Agriculture in Texas. And I think a lot of conservative grassroots people really appreciated his take and saw his heart and decided to support him. So unlike some of these other races where a lot of conservatives were united with Don Huffines, or a lot of them united around Beau French for railroad commissioner, in the Agriculture Commission, you saw some people say, I've known Sid for a long time. He's been conservative. I want to back him. But you saw probably, in my opinion, if I were to estimate, I would say 2/3 to 80% of the grassroots conservative groups went with the opponent to Sid Miller, Nate Sheets. And so what you also then saw was that Nate's victory came largely from the mid and large size counties, which you're in, Brandon, I'm in Bear County. And we know that in these areas is where some of the biggest conservative infrastructure exists. It's where you have the most grassroots groups that are active. It's where they're really plugged in and actively meeting and organizing. And so that's where you saw Nate Sheets do best, where Sid Miller did best on, and this is actually the same place where Jim Wright did best over Beau French, was in those very rural counties where there's not a lot of conservative groups. There might not even be a Republican club that meets regularly. These are counties where there are 600 to 800 voters total, and about 2/3 of those come from the hinterlands. They don't even come from a city that you could block walk if you wanted. And so in those areas, you saw Jim Wright, Sid Miller doing very well. Nate Sheets really outperformed in the suburbs, in kind of the mid-sized counties. Think of it like Parker County, Wise County, Ellis County, kind of surrounding the Metroplex, and the same thing in the Houston area. And you saw those being the same areas where Beau French was doing really well for railroad commissioner. So I was a little surprised, but I knew it was going to be close. I gave Sid Miller an advantage going into election night just because of how much name ID he had. But I actually, on a personal level, I'm not super motivated against Sid, but I was very pleasantly surprised that Nate won. I personally voted for him and encourage people to vote for him. I think he's going to be a fantastic agriculture commissioner.
Yeah, and his message of "Make America Healthy Again" really resonated with voters as well. Let's talk about Don Huffines defeating Kelly Hancock for comptroller after Don losing his Senate reelection in 2018 and then unsuccessfully challenging Greg Abbott in 2022 for governor. Comes back in 2026 and wins the comptroller seat. This is a pretty big win for Don. So, what is Don going to do to Doge Texas?
I'm really proud of Don, put in a ton of effort. I really am proud of the Huffines family. For anybody who knows the Huffines, this has never been a 1 or 2 person effort. This is a team effort. I appreciate this coming from a large family of 7 children, and my wife's one of 10. So I get once one's in, we're all in. And the Huffines family is very much that way. So not only Don and Mary Catherine, but also all their kids and their grandkids were actually invested in this race. And so I really am proud of the work that he did and what he was able to accomplish without a runoff. I think that Kelly Hancock's ultimate decision to try to impeach Ken Paxton and some of his other more moderate votes over his record just meant that it was a lot harder for him to find the energy around the state. Kelly has never been somebody who's really tried to align with the grassroots. I think he could have put more effort into that. And so when all of a sudden you want to run statewide, and you haven't been going to these groups and supporting their efforts and supporting their causes and trying to amplify their voices, then it's really hard to get them to turn around and help you. And so we saw that ultimately all that Don had done for the last decade started to pay off with all these people giving back and trying to support him and tell their friends to support him. So I definitely think people did not anticipate him performing as high as he did, but in the final weeks, you could definitely feel the Huffine surge happening and the likelihood of him getting over 50% being pretty high. But I think he did overperform even people's expectations who thought he was going to win without a runoff.
Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate Don just on a personal note because he helped start the football division in the Homeschool Athletic Association, and I have four kids who are all homeschooled, and my son who just turned 18 plays football for HSAA, and that's due to Don's contributions because he wanted a football league for his kids to play in when they were homeschooled. So I appreciate that, and I think Don's going to do a good job of doging Texas, getting rid of giving money to illegals. One thing I'm concerned about is all the money going to the mosque from the state of Texas. I mean, I hope he has a hand in doging a lot of that. I think he'll do a good job.
I think you're right that he will do a great job doging Texas. He's going to have his eyes on all the money. And Don's the type of person that you would like having his eyes on all the money, where it's moving and how it's flowing. Um, I am not an expert on all the money that has gone to different mosques, but the little bit of effort I've put into it, I have not seen state dollars in the state appropriations that are going to mosques. There's these federal programs for like security upgrades and stuff that the state administers but doesn't control. It's like pass through stuff. So we're going to have to figure out exactly what that is. I can just say that because I've seen those lists all across Twitter. I have made calls to different people to try to figure out, like, is this an amendment to the Texas budget that you could offer that would stop it? Because I know a lot of lawmakers that would be willing to do that. It doesn't seem like that's the case, but we need to get creative with anything we could do to try to stop it. Or, and this has been why I've asked these questions, if the money is coming from the feds and they're the ones who have to stop it, then we need to ask our congressman to then go get some rule applied or some commission. So I'm trying to hunt it down to figure out who the heck is the decision maker that can help us shut that money down.
Yeah, nobody really knows. I mean, it's kind of a betwixt and between the federal level and the state. We're trying to figure out who's got the football. Let's talk about the attorney general's race. Were you surprised that Paxton's handpicked successor, Aaron Reitz, did not make it into the runoff?
I wasn't. I think a lot of us anticipated Chip Roy and Mays Middleton being the two in the runoff from relatively early on. Um, I've said this on my show, and I think it probably gets more people upset than not. But I think we've done a good job as conservatives winning by the fact that we have Chip Roy and Mays Middleton in a runoff. These are two people. Mays Middleton is one of the most conservative state senators in the state of Texas, and Chip Roy is one of the most conservative congressmen in the nation. There's not really a debate around that. Like, you can look at any ranking anywhere, and that's the case. In their respective legislative positions, they have fought very hard. They have not become part of the DC swamp or Austin swamp. And so I think conservative grassroots people should be, one, really appreciative of the fact that this isn't like a Ken Paxton, Dan Branch runoff, where we had Ken Paxton and then I mean, biggest Austin swamp creature you could have from Highland Park, Texas, trying to take over the Attorney General's office. That's not the runoff scenario we find ourselves in with Chip Roy and Ms. Middleton. Now, there's a lot of people that very passionately support Chip Roy and very passionately support Mays Middleton. And I think those are all patriots. But I do think it's a real blessing that we are able to have two strong conservatives in the runoff.
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, Mays is in the lead right now, but any predictions on the runoff? Who's going to clinch it?
I don't know. I think it's definitely an advantage to Mays, based on the fact that he built a strong state-based coalition. Chip had a tremendous amount of support from a lot of federal conservative groups who have seen the work that he's done, but those groups do not have as much influence on state electoral decisions that voters make as all these state-based conservative grassroots organizations that Mays has worked more closely with. And so that's why I give the advantage to Mays going into the runoff.
Yeah. Let's talk about Brandon Herrera defeating Tony Gonzalez. Now, this was Brandon's second attempt, and he made it into the runoff against Gonzalez, and Gonzalez dropped out. So, what happened in that race?
I mean, ultimately, really grateful when people are willing to go back to back and run again. A lot of people that you and I know who are in the legislature today were not there because of their first run. Andy Hopper lost 2 races, then won the third. Shelley Luther ran 2 races and lost, then got elected as the state representative. So many of the conservative champions we have today had to run a couple times to get elected. And so Brandon ran last time, came close in a runoff within several hundred votes of Tony Gonzalez, decided to run again this time, knowing that President Trump and others likely would come in for Tony Gonzalez, which they did. But Tony's record is still Tony's record. And so I think that Tony was headed to a runoff before the scandal broke, which was kind of the, I guess, best kept secret. I mean, or worst kept secret. We all knew that when Tony's district director had very tragically and sadly ended her life by lighting herself on fire, that there was some kind of inappropriate relationship between Tony and her. And that was something that was very well known and spoken about just locally. I live in that congressional district, so I know a lot of these people. Um, but then the Express News actually got a former staffer to go on record and confirm it. And then the dam kind of broke. And so his district director's husband came out and went on record and talked about some of the communication between Tony Gonzalez and his staffer and his actions. And so that really just continued to have a snowballing effect, not only for how well Brandon did on election day, because that broke very late, but it also affected why Mike Johnson and others told Tony, you need to step aside. And so saving ourselves from that bloody runoff and being able to focus on the general is a real blessing for that district, because it is one that Democrats are going to spend heavily on, as they will across the state. So we're going to have to fight very hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about some races up in my neck of the woods here. So, Lieutenant Colonel Larry Brock lost to Jared Patterson by almost 20 points. Matt Thorson lost to Jeff Leach by almost 29 points. What happened in those races?
Jared Patterson is one I've already commented on publicly. Jared underperformed everyone's expectations, including the entire Austin Swamp. He basically, Larry ran hard, but did not have as much financial support and others that other individual candidates were able to amass in their challenge races. There was another gentleman in that race named Rick Abraham who ended up getting 12%. He got 12%, spending like, I don't know, 3 grand. And so Jared only got 54%, 50, between I think 53 and 54% of the vote for his reelection campaign. And everyone anticipated him finishing in the 60s, as most of the incumbents in the DFW did. David Lowe. So it's just to give a comparison, Andy Hopper had three, four, $500,000 spent against him and gets 70% of the vote for his reelection. And then Jared Patterson has substantially less money spent against him, and he gets 53 or 54%. So Jared's definitely seen as somebody who clearly does not know his district as well as he thinks he does. And conservatives in Denton County should be encouraged by how well they all did, in comparison to like $1 million that Jared Patterson spent. He outspent his opponents, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 to 1, and was only able to get 54% of the vote. So that shows a significant shift with Jeff Leach. I feel like the last 2 races, just my bird's eye view of those 2 races that he's dealt with in the last 2 years, he's basically come in and groups have spent a tremendous amount of money in the final 2 weeks, and he's able to break a lot of undecideds his way. And so he's been able to have strong finishes of over 60% both times. And it also helps that Jeff has carried a lot more Republican conservative policy than some of his other colleagues, who have been challenged from the right. And so he's able to point to that. But the reality is that conservatives did take on less incumbents than in general this election cycle, I would say holistically speaking, than what happened last cycle. 17 Republican incumbents lost their primary, the most in maybe Texas history, definitely modern Texas history. And this last election cycle, you had a handful of these incumbents taken out, both Stan Kitzman and Cecil Bell. But then you also had a lot of more liberal Republicans leave that were then replaced by conservatives, which was easier to accomplish in this kind of election cycle where President Trump, Governor Abbott, and Senator Ted Cruz endorsed everybody who voted for school choice. So all of these incumbents running all had, including Andy Hopper to David Lowe to Jared Patterson to Jeff Leach, they all had President Trump, Governor Greg Abbott, and U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, which made it a little more difficult for conservatives to upgrade those districts. But what they ended up what we ended up seeing is that in the open seats is where conservatives had the biggest pickups. Gary Van Devers, one of the five most liberal Republicans in the Texas House, was replaced by Chris Spencer, who's a strong conservative reformer. You have Giovanni Capriglione, who is one of the most liberals in the most liberal Republicans in the Texas House, and also caught up in a horrible scandal. Leaves office, tries to handpick his successor, and fails to do so. Conservatives all rally behind Armin Mazzani before Giovanni handpicked anybody, and Armin was able to win that without a runoff. Tony Tinderholt left to go be a county commissioner. Sands and TLR spent heavily, well over $1 million, to try to defeat Cheryl Bean in that election, and Cheryl won without a runoff to replace Tony Tinderholt, backed by Tim O'Hare, Tony Tinderholt, Nate Schatzline, David Lowe, David Cook, and all the other conservatives in Tarrant County. So I say all those things very quickly to say that most of the conservative upgrades we're seeing in the House that moves that chamber to the right happened within open seats because more liberal Republicans left than conservative Republicans, and those liberal Republicans were largely replaced by much more conservative individuals. And so that should mean that the caucus as a whole is more conservative, which hopefully means that when you and I and a bunch of other conservative grassroots people are pushing the legislature to deliver more, as long as we do well in November, which is the big if, we take that for granted, but as long as we do well in November, we should be able to pass more conservative policies.
Yeah, that should bode well, hopefully, in the 90th legislature. Let's talk about optics of Jeff Leach's campaign for just a second. So, on election day, I was a little surprised to see Dr. Tom Oliverson drive up from Cypress, Texas to stand at the polls with Jeff. Was he sending a message as the Republican caucus chair that he's possibly considering Jeff Leach for the next Speaker of the House, or is Burrows going to get another shot at that? What are your thoughts?
Well, Dr. Oliverson, as far as I've seen, has basically been willing to stand and support any Republican caucus member. And that's typically and traditionally how it's worked. The Republican caucus supports members of the Republican caucus. And so if you're a chair and Andy Hopper reaches out to you, or Jeff Leach reaches out to you, or Cecil Bell reaches out to you, or David Lowe reaches out to you and says, hey, can the caucus have some members of the caucus and leadership of the caucus come and stand polls for me? Historically and traditionally, the caucus has always said yes. And so that doesn't surprise. I wouldn't read too much into that. I would just see that as kind of the typical behavior of Republican caucus leadership because they tend to stand in support of Republican caucus members.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, let's talk about one of the Texas Senate races. Grassroots challenger Rhonda Ward lost to Trent Ashby. Rhonda raised like $2.6 million to Trent's $3.6 million. Were you surprised with that amount of fundraising that Rhonda only got 37.7% of the vote? Or was Trent Ashby just that well known from serving in the Texas House for over 13 years?
Again, this is another one where I'm not going to get super detailed and hypercritical of Rhonda's campaign. I think Rhonda's a fantastic conservative. I think she ran her heart out. I think Kristen Bentley and a lot of people who were on the ground in that campaign worked really, really hard and made that a very contentious race. So I will give her a lot of credit for that. And I know she had a ton of grassroots support. Often the margins at the end, and maybe this is a way to think about several of the races you've asked about. The margins at the end are not always the margins 2 or 3 weeks out. What tends to happen, if I'm going to be honest, kind of big picture statewide, 2 or 3 weeks out from election day, there's usually a lot closer races than what ends up being on election day. Because 20 to 25% of voters make their decision in the final couple weeks of the election. So the polling I saw on a lot of the races that ended up 20-point spreads 2 or 3 weeks out were much, much closer. Then what happens is some conservative candidates are able to maintain that momentum for the last 2 to 3 weeks and either come very close or eclipse the challenger they're running against. And in some cases, those close races then get much wider. Okay. That's my big picture observation. So we will then tend to analyze those campaigns as though they never had a chance. And that's usually not the case. What's often the case is now some of them don't, meaning they were never close, right? There's a lot of candidates that run for office and they're 30, 40 points behind the person they're running against, and they're there all 6 months. So you go, this person never had a chance. Others will get their races very close, but won't be able to sustain it. And there's all sorts of strategic decisions that come into play, whether it's how much you're spending and how early you're spending it. I would say the way I explain campaign spending, in my opinion, is you have a certain amount of bullets and you like pop up and start shooting. And you don't want to do it until you know you can sustain fire until election day, right? Because what the worst case scenario is, which happens to quite a few campaigns, is you run out of bullets and you're 2 weeks out, and then you just have to hunker down. And now cannon fodder's coming, and mortar shells are flying, and an F-16 flies over and obliterates your back field, and then you go, okay, well, this is not ending the way I thought it was going to end when I was up taking out some of the enemy. And so that's like the example I give at times. So I would say that that's probably a similar situation. Now to SD3 specifically, I think I didn't see enough detailed polling to know exactly why undecideds broke so heavily towards Trent Ashby. Trent Ashby is more conservative than Senator Robert Nichols, who he was replacing. Rhonda Ward was willing to run against Robert Nichols. My assumption is that if Nichols had decided to run for reelection, I think Rhonda Ward likely would have unseated him. And I think that Trent running and having less of a problematic record than Nichols significantly made him more difficult to defeat from Rhonda and her team. And I think Trent being willing to have voted with the Republican caucus a lot more than Robert Nichols did put him in a much better position. And so for undecided voters in the final weeks, I don't know the spending, I don't know the TV time. Like if we looked at all that, how many mailers and texts in the final time, at some point, clearly Trent was able to kind of turn the race and make sure that undecideds were leaning his way in those final weeks.
Yeah. Let's talk about the State Board of Education. You mentioned on your show that we haven't had a conservative majority in the SBOE for like over 10 years. And we went 4 for 4 on election night with Huddleston, Bumgarner, Nelson, and Hinojosa. So, I mean, what went on with that race? Why did so many conservatives win?
I think because finally people have gotten tired of having problems with the State Board of Education. Their lack of courage to be able to address the rot in our public school system has finally reached the point to where grassroots are saying this is ridiculous, we're done. And the fact that we passed school choice and others defeated the teacher unions enough to where they were much less motivated to run the type of organized campaigns that they've run in the past. So we saw kind of a convergence of both our enemies being somewhat deflated and conservatives being more engaged. So Casson Huddleston, who I'm sure you know, pastor out of Rockwall County, he was the chaplain of the Texas GOP, a fantastic patriot, won without a runoff, replacing Kevin Ellis, who is just, again, sometimes a really good Republican and sometimes open to voting with Democrats. And so Casson, anybody who knows him would say he's going to be a consistent conservative every single time. Mindy Bumgarner, whose husband is ranked in the top third of conservatives in the legislature, is replacing Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn Brooks is somebody who voted with Democrats more than anybody else on that board. And she was quick. She was basically in lockstep with the Democrats on any meaningful battle that we had. And so there's that race. There's the Casson race. Victoria Hinojosa, whose husband Adam Hinojosa serves in the state senate and was a very conservative, consistent Republican, is replacing LJ Francis. LJ was just caught in a scandal, had lived a dishonest life on a couple levels, and that caught him up, or I don't know, it caught him, and it finally came to fruition to the point that people said, okay, we want a stronger candidate going into the general election. And then Tiffany Nelson down in Montgomery and Harris County, also aligning with that conservative resurgence in Montgomery County, took her across the finish line. Will Hickman had been the swing vote on a number of votes, which he ultimately did end up with us in a couple of those swing vote efforts, but it took a lot of work. And Tiffany Nelson's somebody who we know when she sees the right position and the wrong position is going to pick the right position. So we are uniquely positioned to have 8 or 9 conservatives, and that's huge.
Let's talk briefly about the ballot propositions. Of course, all 10 propositions passed, Prop 10 passing by 95% of voter approval. Any surprises there?
No, I think that was going to be the top performing ballot item from the beginning. I mean, people are just sick and tired of it, and they're finally talking about it. My show about a week ago, I interviewed Brent Money on his Sharia Free Texas caucus that he formed, and they've already gotten close to a majority of the Republican caucus to join. And I think, I don't know, they might have the entire Republican caucus join that thing by the time we come to next session. people are sick and tired of it. It's even gotten to the point of, very established Republican donors that I know who normally aren't engaged in some of these cultural battles asking questions of people. The statewide candidates that I've talked to have said, hey, I can't leave a meeting without somebody asking me about the Islamification of Texas. So I feel like we've finally broken that issue through to be on the radar of so many people. And I was really encouraged by the fact that it was a top performing ballot initiative. I anticipated that being the case when it was put on, just because it's such a white and black issue. People know.
Yeah. Last question. Let's talk about state convention that's coming up in a couple of months. We've got Dorinda Randall running against Abraham George. Of course, David Covey running for the vice chair. Abraham, the lawsuit did not finish in time to close the primary. Of course, it got held up with, Jane Nelson pushing back with the SOS. Is that the reason why Dorinda is running against Abraham? And how do you think this election is going to go for chair?
Well, you'd have to ask her if that's the reason why. I don't think anybody anticipated that lawsuit finishing in time to close this primary. I think that Matt Rinaldi and Abraham George have been willing to be quite visionary in the way they've approached closing the primary. Um, we should all be really grateful that we have a chair that was willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in state resources, state Republican Party resources, to try to accomplish the will of the delegates. And that is something that I think we are on track to do. So ultimately, we're going to have to see what the court does. Abraham George, Matt Rinaldi, myself, you, everybody else, none of us control the courts. So we're not going to decide what the federal judge decides, but they will rule one way or the other. And Ken Paxton siding with the Republican Party is super helpful. Hopefully they do rule that we have the right of free association and that we can close our own primaries. And then that leads to policy passing in 2027 that would close the primaries and make it even easier to do that. So that would be super helpful. Having the state's support in that would make the primary much easier. You see in counties like when Gillespie County last election said, we want to hand count all our ballots. And it took till 1 a.m. for us to have a single vote tallied up there. It isn't easy when the actual county government there is not actually assisting the Republican Party in holding its election the way it wants to. So us kind of figuring out hand in hand how to do this is really important. I think Abraham George has done a great job as chair, being willing to push legislative priorities in the way that we've all asked him to, in pushing to close the primaries, even though there's a lot of pressure from a lot of moderate donors to not spend party resources on things like keeping Democrats out of our primary. They're not really motivated to do that. So I'm really encouraged by what he's done as chair. And it's going to be an eventful state convention when everybody gets there.
Absolutely. Luke, I appreciate you coming on my show tonight. I've got your website up here, lukemacias.com. Is that where people go to find out more information about your podcast and what you do?
They can go to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It's just once a week on Texas politics. I try to keep it under 30 minutes, just giving everybody a quick update on the goings on in Texas, some of the inside perspective of what's happening and the different moves that are occurring and how that affects their everyday lives.
Awesome. Well, Luke, thank you so much for coming on the Daniel Report. I look forward to seeing you at state convention in June, and God bless you, my friend, and keep up the good fight.
God bless you, Brandon.
God bless.